She had prepared the perfect dinner to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. Candles lit, wine poured, hearts pounding with the excitement of their first love. But as she walked through the door, she found her beloved husband embracing her best friend. Then, that night, in the pouring rain of Manhattan, she inadvertently witnessed an assassination, and the man who survived pulled her into a world from which there was no return. This is the story of Vivian Hale. Like, if you want to know how she survived, and comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. The candles had been burning for 40 minutes by the time Vivian accepted he wasn't coming. She stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel folded over one arm and watched the wax melt down the brass holders she'd found at a Sunday market on Bleecker Street 3 years ago. Back when she still did things like wander through Sunday markets because the morning felt wide open and unhurried. The apartment smelled of rosemary and roasted garlic, and the particular kind of quiet that starts to feel wrong after a while. Outside, rain moved across the glass in slow diagonal sheets. Manhattan in November looked like a city apologizing for something it hadn't done yet. She had cooked for 2 hours. The lamb rack Ethan had mentioned only once, maybe 14 months ago, at a colleague's dinner party, that he'd always wanted to try properly. She'd tracked down the cut, watched videos, called her mother about the herb crust. Her mother had said, "You're a pediatrician, Vivian, not a chef," and laughed. And Vivian had laughed too, but she'd still written the steps on a notepad in her precise physician's handwriting and taped it to the cabinet above the stove. She checked her phone. No messages. She'd sent 3. It wasn't the first time Ethan had been late. It wasn't even the first time he'd missed something important. There was the birthday dinner 2 years ago, the gallery opening she'd bought tickets for 6 weeks in advance, the weekend in Vermont that got canceled at the last minute because of something at the firm that he never fully explained. He was always sorry afterward. He had a talent for sorry, the kind that came with physical presence, his large hand cupping the back of her neck, his voice low and specific, referencing the exact thing she'd wanted so she'd know he'd been paying attention even when he hadn't been there. She'd always accepted it. She told herself that was what love looked like when 2 serious people tried to build something inside the machinery of New York. She tried his number. It rang through to voicemail. His professional recording, clipped and confident. "You've reached Ethan Cross. Leave your message and I'll return your call." She hung up. The lamb was going to be overcooked. She turned the oven down and poured herself a glass of the wine she'd opened to breathe an hour ago. Drank half of it standing at the counter. Thought about the afternoon. The way she'd left St. Cornelius Children's Hospital at 4:15, earlier than she'd left on a weekday in months, trading favors with Raj so she could have the evening clear. Thought about the dress still in the dry cleaning bag on the bedroom door because she hadn't wanted to wrinkle it. She went and put the dress on anyway. Not for him, just because she'd told herself she was going to. When she heard the elevator at 9:47, she felt the tension leave her shoulders before she'd consciously registered the sound. She set her wine glass down, smoothed the dress, was already composing the version of the evening that started with relief instead of reproach. The elevator doors opened. She heard voices. She heard Madeline's laugh first, the specific quality of it, low and warm and without its usual performance for an audience, the laugh Vivian had known since they were 12 years old, sharing a study table at the public library because both their apartments were too loud for homework. Then Ethan's voice saying something short, private. The words cut off at the edges. Then a silence that was not the silence of 2 people stopping to look for a light switch. Vivian walked down the hall. Later she would understand that she already knew. The body processes certain information faster than the conscious mind will allow, and somewhere between the kitchen and the bedroom doorway, her nervous system had already finished the calculation. But she walked down the hall anyway, because some part of her needed to be wrong rather than spared. She was not wrong. The bedroom door was open. The lamp on Ethan's nightstand, the one she'd bought him, warm bulb because he said overhead light gave him headaches, cast the room in amber. Madeline's coat was on the chair where Vivian always left her bag. Madeline herself was in the bed that Vivian had made that morning with the deliberateness of someone preparing something worth coming home to. Ethan saw her first. He went still in the particular way of someone who has been dreading a specific moment and has now arrived inside it. Madeline turned a half-second later. Her face did something complicated. The beginning of a word, maybe Vivian's name, and then nothing, just the complicated thing. Vivian stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time but was probably less than 5 seconds. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything organized enough in her chest to become language. She turned around, walked back down the hall, picked her coat off the hook by the door, the old charcoal wool coat, not the good one, and her keys and her phone and nothing else. The elevator was still on their floor. She got in. In the lobby, she nodded to the doorman the way she always did. Outside, the rain hit her immediately. She hadn't buttoned her coat. She didn't stop to button it. She walked. She didn't have a direction. She'd lived in the city long enough to navigate it without thinking, and her feet took her west toward the river while her mind stayed somewhere back in the amber light of a bedroom she'd chosen the paint color for, had deliberated over for 2 weeks with sample swatches taped to the wall. Does this read too yellow in the morning? She'd asked Ethan. He'd said it looked fine. He'd been somewhere else even then. Madeline had been her closest friend since childhood. Madeline had been at her residency graduation. Madeline had called her every week for the first 6 months after Vivian's father died. Madeline had stood beside her at the ceremony 5 years ago in a dress the color of pale sage and cried. She'd actually cried, and Vivian had assumed those were the tears of someone who loved her. The rain was serious now. Vivian's hair flattened against her face, and she didn't push it back. She crossed a street without checking the light, and a cab laid on its horn, and she barely registered it. She walked for a long time. The neighborhoods changed around her, the bright retail corridor giving way to quieter blocks, then to the industrial margins of the far west side where the streets widened and the foot traffic disappeared. She didn't track the distance. She was somewhere in the meat of her own grief, which didn't feel like grief yet, which felt like a concussive blankness, the kind that follows impact before the pain finds its location. She stopped eventually because her feet stopped. She was standing in a street she didn't immediately recognize, a service road running between 2 large warehouse buildings, the kind that had been repurposed for event venues or storage, or nothing at all. The streetlights were sparse out here. The rain had thinned to a mist that floated under the lights in slow suspension. She could hear the river somewhere to her left. She stood there and breathed. Then she heard the cars, 2 of them, coming in without headlights from opposite ends of the service road. She registered this as wrong before she registered anything else. The dark approach, the coordinated timing, the low-speed precision that had nothing recreational about it. She stepped back instinctively into the shadow of a recessed loading dock, pressing herself against the metal door. A third vehicle was already parked at the center of the road. A black SUV, engine off. The driver's door opened and a man got out, tall, unhurried, a quality of stillness about his posture that seemed deliberate. He looked at both approaching cars with the same calm expression and said something to someone still inside the vehicle. In the thin light, Vivian could make out the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. The 2 cars stopped. Doors opened. She counted 6 men. All of them moved with the specific purposefulness of people who had rehearsed this, which meant it was not a meeting or a confrontation, but something already decided. One of them raised his arm. Vivian understood what she was seeing before she heard the first shot. She pressed herself harder against the metal door and did not breathe. The sound of gunfire in an enclosed street is not what movies prepare you for. It is concussive and echoless and physically percussive, felt in the sternum before it registers in the ears. She heard glass breaking. She heard men shouting in at least 2 languages. She heard the return fire from the SUV, which meant someone inside it was still alive. The tall man was down behind his open car door. She could see part of him, one hand visible, moving, and the quality of his movement was controlled in a way that didn't look like panic, like he was somewhere bad that he had already made contingency plans for. She should have run. Every rational nerve ending she had was telling her to move, to get low and go, to use the noise and the confusion to clear the street and find people and light and a phone signal strong enough to call someone. But her body had locked. It did that sometimes under extreme stress. She'd known it during her residency. The first time a child had coded on her table, the 2 or 3 seconds where she'd been completely outside herself before training overrode the freeze. The training always came eventually, but those seconds were real. One of the shooters turned in her direction. He was maybe 30 feet away. His face was turned into a pool of light from somewhere above the loading dock, and she saw it clearly. The nose, the jaw, the small dark mark on his left cheek. The efficiency of his expression, which was the expression of someone doing a job and not a particularly remarkable one. He hadn't seen her. He was scanning the space and she was in shadow, and he turned back. But she had seen him. She had seen all of them. The way her mind worked under crisis, the involuntary clinical registration, the same mechanism that let her read a room full of symptoms and organize them into a differential, had logged faces, positions, the make and partial plate of both attacking vehicles. The shooter's face was already in some permanent file in her memory that she would not be able to delete. The tall man by the SUV moved. He went low and fast between his door and the vehicle's hood and put 3 shots into the near attacker with a precision that was not frantic. Vivian heard a body fall. The remaining attackers recalibrated. One of them yelled something that sounded like an order to move. And then she made a noise. Not a scream. A single involuntary intake of breath when something, debris, glass, a fragment of something, struck the metal door directly beside her head, and she flinched hard enough to knock her shoulder against the door, which produced a sound. In the sudden partial silence after the burst of gunfire, it was enough. The tall man's head turned. Even at that distance, even in that light, even with everything else happening around him, his eyes found her in the shadow of the loading dock with an accuracy that didn't seem possible. His face was cut. There was blood on the left side of his jaw. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not surprise, not anger, not calculation, or maybe all 3 arranged into something beyond her existing vocabulary for human faces. And then someone fired again, and the moment collapsed. When it was over, when the remaining attackers had retreated to their vehicles and the sound of engines was fading into distance, Vivian was still standing in the loading dock doorway with her back against the metal and her hands pressed flat against the wall behind her, breathing through her nose in the controlled way she'd learned to breathe during procedures. 3 men were dead in the street. The tall man was upright. He was pressing something against his ribs and his breathing was audible from where she stood. Controlled but labored, each exhale measured. He said something to the man who had climbed out of the SUV, and that man looked immediately in her direction. Vivian didn't run this time. Something had shifted. The odds calculation maybe, or just the expenditure of the last of whatever resource running requires. She stood in the doorway and looked at the tall man who had survived 6 armed attackers and was now looking back at her with blood on his face and a patience in his posture that was somehow more frightening than anything she'd witnessed in the last 4 minutes. He walked toward her. He moved like someone who did not expect to be stopped. When he was close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes and the controlled labor of his breathing, he stopped. "How long were you standing there?" he said. It wasn't a question. Vivian's mouth was dry. "Long enough." He looked at her face. She didn't look away. She had looked at enough people in enough difficult rooms to know that looking away was a form of information. "You're a civilian," he said. "Yes." "You saw faces." She didn't answer, which was also information, and he received it without expression. He said one word to the man behind him, a name, short, cut off at 1 syllable, and the man moved immediately to block the end of the service road. Then the tall man looked at her again with that specific quality of attention that made her feel completely inventoried, every external detail processed and filed. "You can't go home," he said. "I know," Vivian said. And the terrible thing, the thing that would haunt her in the weeks that followed, was that she meant it in more ways than one. He turned without another word and walked back to the SUV. The man at the road's end looked at her, and then at his employer, and then back at her with an expression of resigned bewilderment. She understood she was being asked to make a choice. She understood that the street behind her was a crime scene, and that the men who'd driven away knew she'd been standing there, and that her home address was 15 minutes from here and entirely searchable. She walked to the SUV. The door closed behind her. The vehicle began to move. Through the rain-blurred window, the service road disappeared, and with it every remaining piece of the life she had been building for the last 5 years. The apartment, the anniversary dinner going cold on the stove, the candles burning down to nothing in empty rooms, Ethan's voice on a voicemail she would never return. All of it receding in the wet dark behind a vehicle she was riding in willingly, beside a man whose name she didn't know, because the alternative was a door she no longer had any reason to walk back through. The city swallowed them whole. The estate sat behind 3 sets of gates and a tree line so dense it swallowed sound. Vivian had tracked the drive by feel. 40 minutes, 2 highway transitions, a long private road with a surface too smooth to be municipal. They'd taken her phone at the second gate. Not roughly. The man in the front passenger seat had turned and extended his hand with the particular courtesy of someone who understood that politeness and compulsion were not mutually exclusive. She'd given it over. She hadn't had anyone to call anyway. The main house was stone and glass, 4 stories, built into a hillside with the kind of deliberate asymmetry that costs more than symmetry does. Inside, the entry hall was lit with the low amber of expensive fixtures and smelled of wood smoke and something medicinal underneath. 2 men she hadn't seen before materialized from somewhere and positioned themselves without being told. Everyone in this building seemed to know where to stand without being instructed, which told her something about how long they'd been doing this and how thoroughly the choreography had been rehearsed. Nico Moretti walked ahead of her without looking back. He'd said 4 words in the vehicle and none since they'd entered the house. The cut on his jaw had stopped bleeding. He was still pressing his left arm against his ribs with the controlled economy of someone managing pain rather than surrendering to it. A woman appeared at the end of the corridor, 50, severe, silver-haired, wearing the expression of someone who had been disappointed by specifics before and was bracing for more of them. She looked at Nico's ribs and at Vivian's wet dress and at the general catastrophe of the situation and said, in accented English, "How bad?" "2," Nico said. "Maybe cracked. Not through. Sit down." "In a minute." "Now," the woman said, with a flatness that had clearly outlasted decades of being told in a minute. And something in Nico's posture shifted by a single degree. Not submission, but the acknowledgement of a boundary he'd decided not to spend energy on tonight. He moved toward the room at the corridor's end. The woman looked at Vivian. "You're wet," she said. "Yes." "Are you hurt?" Vivian ran the clinical check she always ran, the automatic inventory, head to toe, that her residency had made involuntary. Her hands were abraded from pressing against the loading dock door. Her feet ached. Everything else was intact. "No," she said. The woman studied her for another moment with the measuring quality of someone who had assessed a large number of people under pressure and developed reliable instincts about it. "I'm Carmela," she said. "I run this house." She didn't offer a last name, and the omission was clearly intentional. "Come." She was given a room on the 3rd floor with a window that looked out over the dark mass of the tree line and beyond it the distant smear of highway light. The room had the impersonal precision of a space kept ready without expectation of occupancy. Good sheets, good towels, a closet with 3 changes of women's clothing in roughly her size, which she chose not to think too carefully about. A first aid kit appeared on the bathroom counter. She cleaned her hands. She sat on the edge of the bed in the borrowed clothes, dark trousers, a gray sweater that fit well enough, and looked at the wall and let herself have 3 minutes of something that was not quite crying but was adjacent to it, the physical pressure behind the sternum releasing in controlled increments the way it did after a long code when the outcome had gone the right way and you needed your hands steady for the next thing. 3 minutes. Then she stopped. She was a witness to a homicide, multiple homicides. She was inside an unknown location with no phone and no clear exit, and a man who ran some version of organized crime and had made a decision about her fate that she had not been part of. The facts organized themselves with the same flat clarity she used for diagnoses. The situation was not good. The situation was, in fact, among the worst arrangements of circumstances she could currently construct. But she was alive, which meant there was still a series of decisions available to her, and she had always been better at decisions than at waiting. She went to find Nico Moretti. He was in a room 2 floors down that appeared to function as a study, walls of dark shelving, a desk that had paper on it rather than just the performance of paper, a medical kit open on the side table with the specific disarray of recent use. He was sitting in a chair near the window with his shirt off and his ribs taped, the bruising already visible along his left side in colors that would deepen considerably by morning. The cut on his jaw had been cleaned. He was reading something. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway without any indication of surprise. "You should be sleeping," he said. I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places, she said, or after watching people die. He looked at her for a moment. Sit down. She sat across from him. The lamp between them lit the right side of his face and left the left in shadow, which gave him a divided quality. The controlled, legible surface on one side, and on the other the suggestion of something she didn't have access to yet. Up close, without the adrenaline of the street, she registered the details her clinical eye organized automatically. Mid-40s, no more. The gray at his temples was premature. The hands resting on the desk were large and still and carried old scarring across the knuckles of the right. He was not a man who had always managed things from a distance. "You're a doctor," he said. "Pediatrician." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite amusement. "You checked my ribs in the car." She had. She'd done it without thinking, the reflex of proximity to an injury, her eyes cataloging the way he held himself. 2, maybe 3, cracked. Whoever taped you did a reasonable job. "Carmela. Tell her to check again in the morning. Cracked ribs move." He watched her. The watching had a quality to it that she was beginning to understand. It wasn't aggressive, it was total. He didn't look at pieces of a person. He looked at all of them at once, as if a partial inventory was a form of negligence. It was unsettling in the way that being genuinely seen by someone you didn't trust was unsettling. "You know who I am," he said. "I know your name. I know what the name means in this city." She paused. "You didn't kill me on that street." "No." "You could have." "Yes." "So what happens now?" she said. It came out level, which cost her more than she let show. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone assembling a lie. She'd had enough practice reading that particular silence in exam rooms, in the faces of parents who didn't want to tell her how the injury had actually happened. This was the quiet of someone deciding how much of a true thing to give. "The men who came tonight," he said, "will know there was a witness. They will have a description. They will look." "I know." "Your home address is in several databases that they have access to." "I assumed." "You can't go back there." He said it without inflection, which made it more final than if he'd made it sound like sympathy. Vivian breathed in slowly. "For how long?" "Until this is resolved." "And how long is that?" He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at the window. The tree line was invisible in the dark, just a black mass against a slightly less black sky. She thought about her apartment with the burnt-down candles and the overcooked lamb and the amber-lit bedroom, and thought about how entirely she did not want to go back to it. That was perhaps the single useful thing about the night, that the life she'd be surrendering by staying here was a life she'd already lost before she ever walked into this building. "I want my phone back," she said. "No." "I have patience." "Your hospital will cover your patience." "You can't just—" She stopped. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same complete attention and no apology in it at all. She understood that she was in a negotiation where one party controlled all the material conditions and the other party had only the leverage of making things more or less difficult. She filed that. "Fine," she said. "One call. To the hospital to arrange leave." He considered it with the brevity of someone who had already thought through most angles of a problem before being asked. "Tomorrow," he said. "Monitored." She nodded. It wasn't generosity, it was a calculation, but she'd take it. She went back to her room and slept badly and woke before light with the specific clarity of someone whose nervous system had decided that consciousness was safer than whatever the dreams were doing. The next 4 days were their own kind of education. The estate was not a prison, which was almost worse. A prison had a coherent logic to it, a set of explicit rules governing the space between captive and captor. This had something more ambiguous. She could move through most of the house. She could walk the grounds as far as the inner fence line. Carmela brought her meals and answered practical questions with a precision that stopped exactly at the boundaries of anything Vivian actually wanted to know. The 2 guards whose names she learned were Dante and Ruben maintained a presence that was professional rather than threatening. They were not watching her so much as watching everything that included her. She found the library on the second day. Real books, used books, nothing decorative about the organization of them. She found a copy of Gray's Anatomy that was 20 years old and had annotations in 2 different hands in the margins. She found a shelf of criminal law and 3 texts on financial regulation and a battered copy of a novel she'd loved in medical school, and she stood in front of that particular shelf for a long moment with a feeling she couldn't precisely name. She was there when Nico found her, on the afternoon of the 3rd day. He came in without announcement, which seemed to be how he moved through his own house, and stopped when he saw what she was reading. The law text. She'd found a case that had been annotated in the same hand as the medical book. "Yours," she said. "My father's." He moved to the desk near the window and sat without ceremony. He was dressed simply. Dark trousers, a dark shirt, the kind of clothes that gave nothing away about occasion or intention. The bruising on his ribs was under the fabric, but she could see it in the slight modification of how he sat, the way he didn't lean left. "You're bored," he said. "I'm a person with a job and a schedule, and I've been here 3 days with nothing to do." "You've been reading." "That's not a job." He looked at her steadily. "What would you be doing right now, if none of this had happened?" It was an odd question from him, personal in a way that didn't fit the texture of their previous exchanges. She thought about it honestly rather than deflecting. "Afternoon clinic. I have had a 7-year-old post-op follow-up, a set of twins whose mother never manages to come in without one of them biting the other in the waiting room." She paused. "A lot of paperwork I'm behind on." "You like it," he said. Not a question. "I'm good at it," she said. "That's not the same thing, but yes." He was quiet for a moment. "My father kept that book because he wanted to be a surgeon. Before—" He stopped. "Before circumstances suggested a different direction." Vivian looked at the annotations in the margins. The handwriting was careful, the notes specific. Real engagement with the text, not performance. "He was smart," she said. "Yes." "Are you?" The corner of his mouth moved again with that quality that wasn't quite a smile. "Smart enough." "Smart enough to tell me what's actually happening," she said. "Not the version designed to keep me manageable." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She'd stopped looking away from him 2 days ago because it hadn't accomplished anything. "The men who came the other night work for a syndicate called the Calvano Organization," he said. "They've been pushing against our territory for 18 months. The attempt was more coordinated than previous ones." He paused. "Which means they have better intelligence than they should." "Someone inside," she said. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't correct it. "And me," she said. "You saw Marco Calvano's operations lieutenant. You could identify him, in a courtroom or otherwise." He said it flatly, without elaboration, letting her understand the geometry of her own situation. "Which makes me useful to you," she said, "and dangerous to them." "Yes. So keeping me here is not entirely altruistic." "It was never presented as altruistic," he said. That was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she wanted to calculate. The gathering happened on the 5th day. She heard them arriving from her room, the cars on the private road, the particular quality of activity that preceded something formal. Carmela appeared and said, without preamble, "You'll need to come downstairs. Wear the black." Vivian looked at her. "Why?" "Because Mr. Moretti has asked." She wore the black, a dress she'd noted in the closet and chosen not to examine too carefully, fitted, serious. She came downstairs to find the main reception room occupied by 8 men ranging in age from mid-30s to late 60s, the kind of men whose faces had been arranged by long experience into expressions that gave nothing to strangers. The room smelled of good whiskey and the specific tension of a meeting where not everyone present trusted everyone else. Nico was at the head of the room. He looked at her when she appeared in the doorway, and the look said something she didn't entirely decode, a warning and a request compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. He crossed to her. He stood close enough that his voice was for her only. "There are people in this room who need a reason not to see you as a liability," he said quietly. "I'm going to give them one." "What reason?" she said. The back of her neck was already tightening. He turned to face the room. She was standing at his left side. He said, in a voice that carried to every corner without being raised, "Before we begin, there's something this family should know. Vivian Hale is not a complication to be managed. He paused with the precision of someone who understood exactly what silence did to a room. She's my wife. The quality of quiet that followed was the kind that happens when 8 experienced, dangerous men absorb a statement none of them expected and none of them are yet certain how to answer. Vivian did not move. She did not look at him. She kept her face arranged in the expression of a woman who had not just been introduced as someone's wife to a room full of organized criminals without so much as a prior sentence of warning, because showing them what was actually happening in her chest right now was the one luxury she absolutely could not afford. Nico's hand found the small of her back, light, steady. The physical language of a man who was not asking permission. Across the room, one of the older men, thick-necked, silver-suited, a face like a closed fist, was looking at her with an assessment so thorough it felt like a search. He said, in English with a heavy Italian cadence, "When?" 3 months ago, Nico said. Privately. You'll understand why the timing required discretion. The silver-suited man's eyes moved between them. Vivian met his gaze because she had no other option, and because every instinct she possessed was telling her that hesitation in this room was a form of confession. She said nothing. She let Nico's hand at her back be the sentence. The silver-suited man's expression didn't change, but he reached for his glass and drank, which was the first movement anyone in the room had made since Nico spoke, and the room shifted around it like a tide finding a new direction. Dante appeared at her left. Capo Ferraro would like to speak with you, he said quietly. Alone. Vivian looked at Nico. His jaw was set, his eyes forward. He gave her nothing. No instruction, no warning, no indication of whether this was expected or dangerous or both. Which meant, she understood, that she was going to have to navigate it herself. She was going to have to walk across this room and sit across from a man named Ferraro, who had been deciding since the moment she walked in whether she was an asset or a problem. And she was going to have to be convincing enough that he left this gathering believing the former. She straightened. She crossed the room alone with her shoulders back and the expression of a woman who had learned to walk into difficult rooms without letting them know how difficult she found them. Which was, she reflected, nearly every skill her career had given her, assembled now for a purpose she could never have imagined when she'd first learned it. Ferraro watched her come to him with the stillness of a man who had made a great many decisions about people and found the process neither exciting nor unpleasant, just necessary. She sat. He looked at her hands, the physician's hands, the abraded palms she hadn't been able to fully conceal, and then at her face, and said in his accented English, "How long have you known what he is?" It was the sharpest possible opening, and she absorbed it without flinching. "Long enough," she said, "to still be here." Something moved in his face, not warmth, but a recalibration, minor and significant at once, the adjustment of a man who had expected softness and found something else. "He takes risks," Ferraro said, "bringing an outsider this close." "I'm not an outsider," Vivian said. "You just found that out." He was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly. Then he said, "If this is a lie." "It isn't," she said. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. The room continued around them, voices low, the careful social architecture of powerful men determining whether the ground had shifted and how far. Ferraro finally nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had not been convinced but had decided to reserve his unconvincing for a later date, which in this context was the closest thing to a pass she was going to get. She walked back across the room to Nico. She stood beside him. Good. She did not touch him, and he did not touch her. And the performance of their invented marriage continued in the space between them, in the specific and terrible intimacy of two people who have told the same lie to a dangerous room and now have to carry it together until someone decides to test whether it's true. The gathering ended near midnight. The men filtered out with the same unhurried precision with which they'd arrived. Handshakes exchanged, nothing resolved loudly because nothing in this world ever was. When the last car disappeared down the private road, Vivian turned to Nico in the empty reception room and said, without preamble, "You could have warned me." "No," he said, "I couldn't." "That's not an answer." "It is." He moved to the side table and poured 2 fingers of whiskey and did not offer her any, which she noted. If I'd told you beforehand, your face would have shown the preparation. Ferraro reads preparation. He's been doing it for 40 years. He paused. You did well. Don't compliment me right now, she said. He looked at her, set the glass down. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me what I just agreed to, because that room full of men now believes I'm your wife, which means whatever comes with that, whatever obligations, whatever exposure, whatever danger, just became mine without my consent. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp behind him lit the edges of his shoulders and left his face in the same divided shadow she'd come to associate with him, half legible, half closed. Yes, he said. It came out without deflection, without the architecture of excuse, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who had made a calculated decision at another person's expense and was not going to pretend otherwise. You're right. The honesty of it disarmed her more than an argument would have. She looked at him. He looked back. Ferraro would have called for a vote tonight, he said, on what to do about the witness. The vote would not have gone in your favor. He paused. Now you're untouchable. By our code, by our law, by every man in that room. And by you? She said. The question landed in the room and stayed there. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than she'd heard it. By me also, he said. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it the way she filed things she didn't yet have a category for. Carefully, in a place she could return to. She turned toward the stairs. At the doorway, she stopped without turning back. Nico? It was the first time she'd used his name directly. Yes. Next time you make a decision that involves my life, she said, tell me first. He didn't answer. But when she reached the 3rd floor landing and looked down through the open stairwell, he was still standing exactly where she'd left him, looking up, and the expression on his face was the one thing in this entire building she had not yet learned to read, which meant she understood with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with fear, that she was already in far deeper than either of them had planned. She stopped sleeping through the night somewhere around the end of the 2nd week. It wasn't fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the particular insomnia of a mind that had been given too much new information and not enough framework to organize it, the way the first weeks of residency had felt, when the volume of what she didn't know yet kept surfacing at 3 a.m. with the urgency of something that needed immediate attention. She would wake at 2 or 3 and lie in the dark of the 3rd floor room, listening to the estate's particular nighttime vocabulary, the distant footsteps of the overnight guards, the settling of the old stonework, the wind against the tree line, and run through the inventory of her situation with the same systematic thoroughness she'd once applied to differential diagnoses. She was 14 days into a fabricated marriage to a man who ran organized crime in one of the most surveilled cities in the country. She had witnessed 3 murders. She had lied convincingly to a room full of men who would revise their opinion of her the moment the lie was exposed. She had no phone, limited movement, and a return date to her real life that existed only as a theoretical future point that nobody had defined. And she was, against every reasonable objection her rational mind could assemble, beginning to understand Nico Moretti. Not trust, not anything she would have called trust, but understanding, the slow accumulation of observed detail that her clinical training had made involuntary. The way he moved through the estate in the early morning before anyone else was fully operational, coffee in hand, reading physical documents rather than screens, because he didn't trust anything that could be intercepted. The way he spoke to Carmela, not warmly, exactly, but with a specificity of attention that communicated regard more clearly than warmth would have. The way he had looked at the Gray's Anatomy annotations and said my father's with the flat economy of someone who had compressed an enormous amount of feeling into the smallest possible container because the alternative was a container with no lid. She was studying him the way she studied difficult cases. She told herself it was strategic. She was not entirely sure that was true. On the 15th morning, Dante came to find her in the library. There's been a development, he said. The phrasing was careful in the way that careful phrasing always signaled something bad. She closed the book and followed him downstairs. Nico was in the operations room, A space she'd only seen from the doorway, long table, multiple screens, the functional ugliness of a place designed for use rather than impression. He was standing at the far end of the table with Reuben and a third man she didn't recognize. Younger, tight-faced, with the specific tension of someone delivering news he'd rather not be delivering. They all looked up when she entered. Nico's expression told her nothing, which by now she understood meant it was serious. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me first." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Ethan Cross was taken this morning from a hotel in Midtown, the Calvano organization." The name landed in her chest with a dull, specific weight. She sat down. Not because he'd told her to, because her legs made the decision independently while the rest of her caught up. "He was in a hotel," she said. "The Meridian, 42nd floor. He checked in 11 days ago." 11 days, she turned that over. "He wasn't at the apartment." "No." "Did he know about... Did he go there because of what happened? Because of me?" "We don't know what he knew," Nico said. "What we know is that the Calvano people have him, and this morning we received a communication." The younger man slid a single printed sheet across the table. Vivian looked at it. The language was direct and without drama, the way serious threats usually were. "Return what belongs to us, or Cross dies. You have 72 hours. The wife knows the terms." She read it twice. "The wife," she said. "They believe the marriage," Nico said. "Which means they believe you still have an interest in keeping him alive." Vivian set the paper down carefully. "He betrayed me." "Yes." "They think I'd negotiate for a man who..." She stopped. She looked at Nico. "What are the terms?" "The actual terms." "Territory," he said. "The Calvano family wants the Port Morris operation. 3 warehouses, 2 distribution contracts, the transit access that comes with it. It's worth approximately $40 million in annual revenue." He said it without inflection. "They want us to hand it over in exchange for Cross." "And you won't," she said. "No." She understood this was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. $40 million in annual revenue and the strategic position that came with it, against the life of a man who was nothing to the Moretti organization and had, by his own choices, made himself available to be used as leverage. The calculation was not difficult. She understood this, and still felt the thing in her chest that she recognized, with irritation, as the residue of care, not for Ethan as he currently existed in her understanding of him, but for the abstract principle of a person's life having weight against financial mathematics. "He's innocent," she said. "Whatever he did to me? He's a civilian." "He's leverage," Nico said. "There's a difference." "Not to him there isn't." Nico was quiet for a moment. He was watching her with the full attention she'd come to recognize as his default mode of engagement. Total, undeflected. The kind that made every other person she'd known seem like they were only partially present. "What do you want to do?" he said. It was a genuine question. She understood that, and it was the thing that made her chest tighten further. That he was asking, that the asking was real, that in this room with its screens and its arithmetic, he was actually interested in her answer. "I want to get him out," she said. "Not because I owe him anything, because leaving someone to die when you can prevent it is not something I'm capable of doing." She paused. "And because whatever he knows about the Calvano organization, whatever made them feel comfortable operating through him, that's information you need." Nico looked at her, then at Reuben. Something passed between them that she didn't have the full vocabulary to read. "We'd need to find where they're holding him," Nico said. "We'd need to move fast enough that they don't execute him when they realize we're coming." "Can you do that?" "Possibly." He paused. "It would require resources and exposure I wasn't planning to commit before we've identified our internal problem." "The leak," she said. He didn't confirm it, but the quality of his silence was confirmation enough. "Then identify it faster," she said. The room was quiet. The younger man looked at the table. Reuben looked at Nico. Nico looked at Vivian with an expression she was learning to recognize as the one he wore when something had surprised him, and he was deciding whether to acknowledge it. "All right," he said. The next 36 hours moved with the compressed intensity of a system under pressure. Vivian was given limited access to the operations room, enough to understand the architecture of what was happening without the complete picture, which she suspected was deliberate. She watched Nico work. Not from sentimentality, because it told her things. He was methodical without being rigid, which was rarer than people thought. He listened to Ruben and the younger man, whose name was apparently Costa, with the attentiveness of someone who understood that information had no hierarchy, that the least senior person in the room could hold the relevant piece. He made decisions quickly and without the theater of decisiveness, which meant the thinking happened before the meeting rather than during it. On the second evening, Costa came in with something that changed the temperature of the room immediately. She felt it before she understood it, the specific quality of attention that people produce when they've found the thing they were afraid they'd find. Nico read the document Costa handed him. His face did not move. He read it again. Then he set it face down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment with an expression that was the most controlled form of something extremely controlled. "Get Ferraro on the phone," he said. His voice was level. "What is it?" Vivian said. He looked at her. He picked the document back up and slid it across the table. She read it. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading because the name at the top was a name she knew. She'd seen it on financial documents, on joint tax filings, on the lease of the apartment she'd shared for 5 years. The document was a wire transfer record. Multiple wire transfer records spanning 4 years, routing through 3 shell companies before landing in accounts she didn't recognize. The amounts were not small. The routing was not accidental. Ethan's name was on everyone. "This is his financial activity," she said. "Yes. He's been laundering money." She said it slowly, not because she hadn't understood, but because saying it was a different operation than comprehending it. "For the Calvano organization." "For 4 years," Nico said. "Possibly longer. Costa found the earliest record we have from just over 4 years ago, which was 3 months before we got married," she said. The room was very quiet. She looked at the dates, she looked at the amounts. She looked at the shell company names, 3 of them, registered in Delaware, in the Caymans, in Singapore, and she felt the thing happening in her chest that was not grief and not rage, but the specific devastation of retrospective understanding, the moment when the past rearranges itself around a new fact, and every memory you thought you owned turns out to have been something else entirely. Every anniversary dinner, every late night at the firm, every explanation about client meetings and quarterly pressures, and the demands of high-level finance that she'd accepted because she'd trusted him. Not blindly, she'd thought, not stupidly, but with the reasonable faith of a person who believed she knew someone because she'd lived beside them for 5 years and looked directly at them and seen nothing wrong. She hadn't seen it because she hadn't been meant to. She looked up at Nico. "The marriage," she said. "Our marriage. He married me because your professional profile," Nico said. He said it carefully, which she understood was the only kindness available to him in this moment. A respected pediatrician, no criminal associations, clean financial history, the perfect personal cover for someone moving significant money through professional accounts. He paused. "We believe some of the routing used your hospital's billing infrastructure. Your name on the accounts gave the activity a legitimate medical practice profile." The hospital, St. Cornelius, the institution she had given 12-hour days to, had built her reputation inside, had cared about with the specific fierceness of someone who understood that the place where sick children came for help was not merely a job, but a trust. Her hands were flat on the table. She looked at them. They were steady, which surprised some distant part of her. "He used my hospital," she said. "We believe so. We're still verifying the full extent." "And Madeline." The name came out of her before she'd decided to say it. "Was she part of it?" Nico looked at Costa, who looked at the table, which was an answer. Vivian absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she absorbed the worst diagnoses in the worst exam rooms, by staying inside her own body, by keeping her breathing even, by not allowing the magnitude of the information to collapse the distance between feeling it and functioning. She had learned that distance the hard way. She was using it now for something she had never anticipated using it for. "How long has Madeline known?" she said. "We don't have a complete picture," Costa said. His voice was apologetic in the way of someone who understood the inadequacy of the apology. But communication records between her and Cross go back at least 2 years. They predate what you... He stopped. What I walked in on, Vivian said. Yes. 2 years. The weekend trip Madeline had taken her on for her birthday 18 months ago. The one she'd called a gift, a girls' trip, a break from the city. Vivian had told her about a new administrative initiative at the hospital, about the billing restructuring, about the new software the finance department was implementing. She talked about it over dinner because Madeline had asked, had been interested, had asked follow-up questions that Vivian had found touching at the time. Her oldest friend, paying attention to the details of her professional life. She hadn't been paying attention. She'd been gathering information. Vivian stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the tree line was dark and dense and completely indifferent to everything happening on this side of the glass. She put her hand flat against the cold surface and pressed until she could feel the chill moving up through her palm and into her wrist. Behind her, nobody spoke. She thought about the woman she'd been 17 days ago, the one who'd spent 2 hours cooking a rack of lamb for a man who had been using her since before they exchanged vows, who'd walked into a rain-soaked street with no coat and no plan because the life she'd thought she was living had collapsed under her. She'd felt destroyed by that. She'd felt it as the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She understood now that it had been a mercy, that whatever she'd walked away from in that amber-lit bedroom was the surface of something far deeper and far more deliberate, a structure built on the specific architecture of her trust and her reputation and her genuine, uncomplicated love for her work. They hadn't just taken her marriage, they'd reached inside everything she'd built and used it as a mechanism for moving money that funded the same organization currently holding Ethan at gunpoint in an unknown location. She turned around. "I want to be in the room when you find him," she said. Nico looked at her. "Vivian, I'm not asking," she said. "I'm telling you, I want to be there." Her voice was level in the particular way of something that had passed through heat and come out the other side harder. "Not to hurt him, not to do anything that compromises the operation. I want to be in the room when he has to look at me and understand that I know." Nico was quiet for a long moment. He was reading her face with the complete attention he always deployed, looking for the thing underneath the thing she was showing him, and she let him look because she had nothing left to hide in this room. "All right," he said. Costa's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. His face did the thing again, the tightening, the reluctance, and he turned the screen toward Nico without speaking. Nico read it. His jaw set. He looked at Vivian. "They moved the timeline," he said. "We now have 18 hours." And somewhere in the lower levels of the estate, Vivian heard the sound of men beginning to move with the specific purposeful urgency of people for whom 18 hours was not a deadline, but a countdown, and the difference mattered in ways that could not be recovered from if they got it wrong. Nico crossed to the operations table and spread a physical map. Paper, not digital, the kind of choice that told her something about how seriously he took the possibility of surveillance, and began talking to Ruben in a low, rapid exchange that she followed well enough to understand the geometry of the problem. Ethan was being held somewhere in the Red Hook waterfront district, a location Costa had narrowed from cell tower data and a contact inside the Calvano supply chain whose reliability Nico described as good but not perfect, which meant they were moving on a foundation that had a margin of error, and everybody in the room knew it. Vivian stood at the edge of the table and looked at the map and thought about the last time she'd been in Red Hook, a Saturday afternoon 2 summers ago, a waterfront market, Ethan buying her coffee from a vendor near the old pier, his hand at the small of her back, his voice easy and warm. She'd thought that afternoon was one of those ordinary hours that quietly constituted a life. She understood now it had been a performance sustained by someone who had learned precisely how much attention she needed to feel loved, and had deployed it with the calculated efficiency of a man protecting an investment. She didn't cry. She noted the memory, she noted what it now meant, and she filed it in the same place she'd been filing things all evening, the place she would deal with later, when later existed. "I need to know the layout," she said. Nico looked up. "If I'm going in, I need to know what I'm walking into. Exits, sight lines, how many men they're likely to have on Ethan specifically." She paused. "And I need to know what condition he might be in, medically, in case there's no time to wait for someone else." Ruben looked at Nico. Nico looked at Vivian with the expression she had come to understand as the one he wore when she had done something that exceeded his existing model of her, and he was quietly revising. "Show her the floor plan," he said. Costa pulled it up on the nearest screen. Vivian leaned in, and her eyes moved across it with the same systematic efficiency she brought to imaging scans. Organized, fast, building a three-dimensional picture from the flat information. Her heart was loud in her chest. Her hands were steady. 18 hours. Ethan crossed somewhere in the dark of a Red Hook warehouse, held by the same organization he had spent 4 years serving, now disposable to them. A liability wearing the face of leverage. A man who had hollowed out her life from the inside and filled the space with his own careful deceptions. She was going to walk into that building anyway. Not for him. For the version of herself that refused, regardless of what had been done to her, to become someone who left people to die when she had the means to prevent it. Because that version of herself was the only one she intended to keep. She had built her entire adult life around the principle that the body in front of you was the only thing that mattered in the room. Not its history, not what it had done, not what you felt about the person inside it. You treated the wound. You stabilized the damage. You made the decision that preserved life because the alternative was a door you could not unwalk through. Ethan had made her a stranger to herself for 5 years. She was not going to let him finish the job. "I'm ready," she said. Nico looked at her across the table, the map between them, the 18-hour clock running somewhere behind his eyes, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, so that only she could hear it, "You don't have to be hard about this. Not yet." It was the most unexpected thing he had ever said to her. She felt it land somewhere under her sternum and stay there. "I know," she said, "but I think I do." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned back to the map and said, in the full voice of a man issuing a command that would set 18 hours of controlled violence into motion, "We move at midnight." Midnight came in cold off the water. Vivian sat in the back of the second vehicle with Ruben and a man named Tark, whose last name she'd never been given, and whose function she'd deduced from the way he checked his weapon with the specific economy of someone for whom the action was as involuntary as breathing. The convoy was 3 vehicles, Nico in the first, a support team in the third, and between them Vivian in the dark of an armored SUV watching the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway slide past the tinted windows and trying to keep her heart rate below the threshold where her hands would start to feel unreliable. She had been given a vest. Nico had handed it to her himself, without ceremony, the way he handed her things, as if the gesture required no annotation. She'd put it on in the equipment room, and he'd checked the fit with 2 fingers at the shoulder and said nothing. The vest was heavy and smelled of other people's sweat, and she was intensely grateful for it. She'd also been given a radio earpiece and a kit. Compact, military-grade medical supplies, the kind designed for field conditions rather than sterile rooms. She'd inventoried it in 90 seconds and reorganized 2 items for faster access, and Tark had watched her do it with the expression of a man quietly revising an assumption. The target location was a converted cold storage facility 3 blocks from the Red Hook waterfront. 4 stories, loading dock access on the south side, 2 street-level entry points. The upper floors largely disused. Costa's source had put Ethan on the second floor, east side, in a room that had been used for this kind of thing before based on the anchor hardware someone had installed in the concrete walls. The detail had made Vivian's jaw tighten when she'd heard it. She'd kept her face neutral. Calvano was expected to have 6 to 8 men on site. The number had a margin of error that Nico had acknowledged and then set aside, which meant the plan accounted for more and hoped for fewer. Their own team was 12, enough for the building's geometry if everything went cleanly, which Vivian understood from Nico's measured silence on the drive meant he did not expect everything to go cleanly. 2 minutes, Ruben said. His voice was quiet and level. In the front seat, the driver killed the headlights, and the vehicle moved on parking lights, only through a street that was empty at this hour, the warehouses on either side dark and indifferent. Vivian looked at her hands, steady. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth in the 4-count pattern she'd taught herself during her first year of residency when the cases got too large for the space inside her chest and she'd needed a mechanism. The pattern still worked. It worked now. The vehicles stopped. Nico's voice came through the earpiece, low precise, the voice of a man who had done this enough times that the operational vocabulary was native rather than learned. Tark, East Loading Dock. Reuben, South Entry with 3. Vivian stays back until I call. Clear. She didn't argue. She had agreed to this condition in the planning room and she intended to honor it. Not because she'd been told to, but because she understood her own limits, understood that in the first 60 seconds of entry, she would be a liability rather than an asset, and that her value came after, in whatever room Ethan was in the specific skills she carried that nobody else on this team possessed. She watched Tark go. She watched Reuben move with his 3 men toward the south corner of the building with the smooth, coordinated silence of people who had trained together long enough that communication was mostly physical. A hand signal, a nod, the slight shift of weight that said ready. The night was very cold. She could see her breath in the ambient light from the distant waterfront. Then the first shot came from inside the building and everything accelerated. It was not the coordinated entry they'd planned. Someone inside had seen something, a camera, a movement, a reflection, and the first 60 seconds of careful approach collapsed into noise. Vivian heard Nico's voice in the earpiece saying something short and clipped that she didn't fully catch, and then Reuben's acknowledgement, and then the sound of the south entry door going and the specific layered cacophony of a firefight inside a concrete structure. The acoustics brutally amplified, every shot a physical event rather than just a sound. She was out of the vehicle before she'd consciously decided to move. Tark was at the east loading dock, the door already breached, and he turned when he heard her and his face said everything. The refusal forming. And she said, "I heard shooting. I'm going in," and walked past him into the dark of the loading bay before he could organize the refusal into words. Inside, the building was cold in the specific way of spaces that had been unheated for years. The kind of cold that lives in walls and floors, that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with abandonment. The loading bay was large and mostly empty, concrete pillars at intervals, the smell of old refrigerant and rust and something else beneath it that she identified as industrial cleaning solvent. Emergency lighting at the exits threw thin red light in pools that illuminated very little and suggested a great deal. She heard Nico's team on the floor above, the movement, the voices. Another burst of gunfire that rattled through the ceiling structure and released a fine dust into the red-lit air. She moved toward the east stairwell, staying low, staying to the pillar line. The way she'd moved through enough crowded hospital corridors to make tight navigation automatic, even when the tight space was this instead of that. The stairwell door was heavy metal. She pushed it open slowly and went up. The second floor was a long corridor with doors on the east side. What had been individual cold storage units, each with its own heavy door, most of them standing open. The corridor was lit by a single working overhead fixture at the far end that cast the space in a flat white light. Halfway down the corridor, a man was positioned with his back to her, watching the far end where the sounds of Nico's team were louder now, closer. Vivian stopped. She pressed into the shadow of the nearest open door. Her heart was very loud. She watched the man and thought about what she had available. She had the medical kit. She had the radio. She had the vest and the cold and the darkness of the door she was standing in. She had no weapon. This had been discussed in the planning room, and she'd accepted it as logical and was now feeling the specific consequences of that logic in the form of a man with a gun standing between her and the room where Ethan was being held. She waited. 30 seconds. 40. The sounds from the far end of the corridor intensified, and the man shifted his weight forward, his attention pulled. She moved, not at him, past him, using the open doors as cover. 3 fast steps to the next door. Stop. Listen. The man still turned away. 3 more steps to the next. She was 4 doors from the end of the corridor. The earpiece gave her Nico's voice again, closer now, and she understood from the specific words that his team had cleared the west side of the floor and was moving east. The third door from the end was different from the others. It was closed, and at the base of it, visible in the flat corridor light, was the specific color of dried blood. She crossed to it in 2 steps, pulled the handle, and pushed it open. The room was small, 8 feet by 10, the dimensions of a former single cold unit. Ethan Cross was on the floor with his back against the far wall, and his hands secured behind him with the kind of industrial plastic restraint that was not designed with release in mind. He was alive. She ran the inventory in the 2 seconds she had before he registered who she was. Head laceration, left, significant but not arterial. Right eye swollen to closure. Breathing labored in the specific pattern of cracked or bruised ribs. The same injury she'd identified on Nico 2 weeks ago under entirely different circumstances, which struck her with a dark irony that she set immediately aside. Ethan's one functioning eye focused on her. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a clean word for. Relief and shame, and something that might have been terror operating beneath both of them. "Vivian," he said. His voice was wrecked. Dehydrated, she noted. Possibly a day or more without water. "Don't," she said. She crossed to him and crouched and looked at the restraints. "I need something to cut these." Left pocket of the jacket. He tilted his head toward a jacket on the floor that had been removed from him at some point. She found it. A small folding knife. The kind kept for practical purposes. She cut the restraints. He made a sound when his arms came forward. Shoulder, she noted. Possibly dislocated. She didn't ask. She looked. The way the right shoulder sat slightly wrong, the involuntary protective posture of the arm. She would deal with it when they were out. "Can you stand?" she said. "Yes." He said it before trying, which told her he didn't know. She braced him and he got to his feet in stages, the rib injury and the shoulder working against each other, his face doing the things faces do when multiple pain signals arrive simultaneously and the body has to decide which one to prioritize. He was standing. He was looking at her. His ruined face held an expression she recognized from exam rooms. The specific quality of someone who understands they are in the presence of a person who is choosing, despite everything, to help them, and who is not sure they deserve it. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He closed his eye, opened it. "Vivian, not now," she said. "Move." She got him to the door. The corridor was louder now, the sounds of Nico's team very close. She could hear Ruben's voice specifically, which meant the east approach was nearly clear. She moved Ethan into the corridor, supporting his right side, his weight significant against her shoulder, and they went toward the stairwell end. The man who had been posted at the corridor's far end was no longer there. She didn't know if that was good or bad. She moved faster. They reached the stairwell door as it opened from the other side, and she had a single full-body second of pure animal fear before Ruben's face appeared in the gap, and his expression shifted from operational intensity to something that was not quite relief but occupied the same general territory. "She's here," he said into his radio. "She has cross, second floor east stairwell." He looked at Ethan with the flat professional assessment of someone cataloging damage rather than responding to it. "Can he move?" "He's moving," Vivian said, because Ethan was. They went down the stairs. At the base, the loading bay was different from when she'd entered it. 2 men she didn't recognize were restrained on the floor near the east wall, and Costa was near the exterior door with a phone pressed to his ear and an expression of concentrated urgency. Through the open loading dock door, she could see the cold black air and the distant waterfront light, and 2 of Nico's men positioned outside. She moved Ethan to the nearest pillar and leaned him against it and started on the shoulder. "This is going to be bad for about 3 seconds, she said. "Okay," he said. She repositioned her hands and did it. He made a sound that was mostly contained and his legs buckled briefly, and she held him until they steadied. "Done," she said. She felt the joint settle under her hands with the specific sensation that always made her exhale. "Thank you," he said. She stepped back. She looked at him in the thin red emergency light. The ruined face, the careful way he was holding his newly reset shoulder, the specific quality of a man who has been through something that has removed several layers of the surface he usually presents to the world. She had loved this face. She had trusted what it told her for 5 years. She looked at it now and felt the full distance between what it had been to her and what she now knew it to be, and the distance was enormous and completely unbridgeable. "Vivian," he said, "I know there's nothing. I need you to be quiet," she said, "and I need you to tell Nico's people everything you know about the Calvano financial network. Everything. The accounts, the routing, the names, all of it." She paused. That's how you pay for this. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Nico's voice came through the earpiece clearly. Ground floor, now, we have a problem. The quality of those 5 words, the specific compressed urgency in the voice of a man who did not use urgency lightly, moved her toward the exterior door before she'd finished processing them. Behind her, she heard Ruben getting Ethan moving. Outside, the cold hit her immediately, and she found Nico at the corner of the building facing the waterfront, where the situation had changed considerably from what the intelligence had suggested. There were more vehicles than planned, 3 of them, positioned across the access road at angles that were not accidental. Between the vehicles and the building stood 7 men, and in front of them, unhurried, wearing the expression of someone who had prepared for this specific evening and found it proceeding according to his expectations, stood a man she hadn't seen before. Heavy, gray-suited, the kind of physical authority that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with the certainty of someone accustomed to the outcome going their way. Calvano, Nico said. Beside her, not looking at her, his voice carrying the specific flatness of a man who has just understood that the intelligence failure was larger than estimated. He came himself. Calvano looked across the space between them and said, in a voice designed to carry, Moretti, I appreciate the efficiency. You brought him out for me. He gestured at Ethan, who had appeared in the loading dock doorway behind them. And I see you brought the wife. His eyes moved to Vivian with the specific quality of a man who had heard about her and had formed an opinion that he had not yet been given reason to revise. A pediatrician. He said it like a punchline. He always had unusual taste. Nico said nothing. Vivian could feel the calculation happening beside her. The geometry of the space, the number of men, the vehicle's positions, the angles of approach and retreat, the same systematic inventory she ran on a difficult case, except the variables here were lethal. Here is what's going to happen, Calvano said. He reached into his jacket and produced a phone and held it up. On this phone is evidence connecting Moretti's operation to 3 federal investigations that have been running for 2 years. Evidence that was provided to me at significant personal cost by someone inside your organization. He paused. Give me Cross and give me the Port Morris Territory documents by morning, or this goes to the federal task force by 6 a.m., and you spend the next decade explaining yourself to people who are considerably less flexible than I am. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room, or a waterfront access road, receives information that rearranges the geometry of everything. Vivian looked at Nico. His jaw was set. His hands were still at his sides. The cut on his jaw from 2 weeks ago had healed to a thin, pale line in the cold light, and his eyes were on Calvano with the expression she now knew was not anger, but something more dangerous than anger. The specific quality of a man doing arithmetic that was going to have consequences. She understood before he spoke what he was calculating. She understood that the phone Calvano was holding was a pressure point that changed the entire architecture of the confrontation. She understood that federal evidence in Calvano's hands meant that the next 6 hours were not about a waterfront standoff, but about something larger, something that required a different kind of response than 12 men and a good approach plan. She also understood something else, something that had assembled itself quietly from the financial documents she'd read in the operations room, from the routing structures Costa had walked her through, from the 4 years of wire transfers that had moved through accounts structured to look like legitimate medical billing. She knew those account structures. She had seen the software. She had sat through 2 implementation meetings for the new billing system at St. Cornelius. And she had, because she was the kind of physician who paid attention to the administrative infrastructure of her institution, actually understood how the routing worked, which meant she understood exactly where the vulnerability in those records was. And she understood that Calvano, holding that phone like a winning hand, did not know that she knew it too. She stepped forward. 1 step, clean and deliberate, and she felt Nico's hand move toward her arm and stop. Felt him make the decision not to pull her back, which was its own form of trust. Calvano looked at her with the mild curiosity of a man who had not expected the variable to move. Those accounts, she said, her voice carried in the cold air without effort. The billing infrastructure you used to route the transfers. St. Cornelius implemented a new compliance audit system 8 months ago, Retroactive flagging. Every transaction routed through those accounts in the last 4 years is now sitting in an automated review queue at the hospital's financial compliance office. She paused. Which means your evidence doesn't just implicate Moretti, it implicates your own network. Every shell company, every routing point. The moment that phone reaches a federal investigator, both sides of those transactions become visible simultaneously. The silence was different this time. Calvano's expression did not change, but something behind it did. The microscopic recalibration of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on has a different composition than he surveilled. "You're bluffing," he said. "I sat in the implementation meeting," she said. "I have the compliance director's direct line in my contacts. The system went live March 14th. Your earliest transfer through those accounts is dated March 2nd of the same year, 12 days outside the retroactive window." She let that land. But the 17 transactions after March 14th are not. Calvano looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Ethan, who was standing in the loading dock doorway with Ruben's hand on his arm and the expression of a man watching the architecture of his own deceptions being used as a weapon by the person he'd deceived most thoroughly. Nico spoke. "Put the phone away," he said, "and we talk about what this actually costs you." The 7 men across the access road did not move. Calvano did not move. The cold came off the water in slow, steady pressure, and Vivian stood in it with her heart running loud and fast behind the vest, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who was completely certain of what she'd just said, which she was, and completely uncertain of whether it would be enough, which she also was. Calvano put the phone in his pocket. It was not surrender. It was a recess, the tactical withdrawal of a man who needed to recalculate before his next move. But it was enough. It was enough for tonight, for this access road, for the 12 men behind her and the 7 across from her and the cold black water beyond all of them. Nico's hand found the small of her back, the same light, steady pressure as the night of the gathering. She didn't lean into it, but she didn't move away. "We're done here," he said, to Calvano and to the night and to everything it contained. Calvano left the way powerful men always leave when they've been outmaneuvered, without acknowledgement, without the grammar of defeat, just the slow withdrawal of vehicles into the dark, as if the entire confrontation had been a scheduling conflict rather than a capitulation. The last set of taillights disappeared around the waterfront access road, and the cold came back in to fill the space they'd occupied, and Vivian stood in it until Ruben touched her arm and said quietly, "We need to move." They moved. The drive back was different from the drive out. The compressed silence of people moving toward something had become the different compressed silence of people who had come through something and had not yet taken full inventory of what it had cost. Ethan was in the 3rd vehicle with Costa and 2 of the support team. Vivian had not looked back when they'd loaded him. She'd gotten into the 2nd vehicle and looked forward and kept her breathing even and said nothing for 40 minutes while the city moved past the tinted glass and the skyline reassembled itself against the dark sky in the particular way it always did coming back from the outer boroughs. Gradual, then sudden, then overwhelming. At the estate, Carmela was waiting. She took one look at the procession coming through the main door, at Nico's face and Vivian's vest and the general evidence of the evening, and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent response available. She disappeared toward the kitchen and returned 12 minutes later with coffee and a medical kit and the particular efficiency of someone who had been performing this function for a long time and had made her peace with it. Ethan was put in a room on the ground floor, not a guest room, a room with a lock on the outside, and Dante stationed in the corridor, which was a form of hospitality that communicated exactly what it meant to. Costa went in with a recorder and a laptop, and the expression of a man who understood that the next several hours were going to be a long exercise in extraction. Vivian did not go in. She stood in the corridor outside the closed door for a moment and listened to the silence on the other side of it, and then walked away. She found Nico in the study. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, still in the operational clothes, the vest gone, but everything else the same. He was looking at the dark tree line and the distant smear of highway light, and he didn't turn when she came in, but the quality of his stillness changed in a way she had learned to read. The acknowledgement of her presence, expressed entirely through the absence of the complete aloneness that had been there a moment before. She sat in the chair across from where he'd been sitting the first night she'd come looking for him. The lamp was on. The room looked the same as it had then. The shelves, the desk with real paper on it, the Gray's Anatomy with his father's handwriting in the margins. Everything the same and completely different. The way places feel after you've been through something in them. "Calvano won't let tonight go," she said. "No." He turned from the window. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Not physically depleted, though that was present too, but something deeper. The tiredness of a man who has been running a particular kind of operation for a long time and has recently been given cause to examine what it has cost him. He sat in the chair on the other side of the lamp. He'll regroup. He'll look at what you said about the compliance system, and he'll have someone verify it. And when they do? When they do, he'll understand that the leverage was real, that using that evidence against us means burning his own network. He paused. Which changes the nature of the problem from a confrontation to a negotiation. "You sound like you prefer it." "Negotiations have outcomes," he said. "Confrontations have survivors." She looked at him. The lamp lit the right side of his face and left the left in shadow, exactly as it had the first night, and she thought about how much she had learned to read in that face in 3 weeks. Not everything, not even close to everything, but enough to understand that the surface was not the thing, and that the thing underneath was more complicated and more worth knowing than she had initially been equipped to assess. "The leak," she said. "Inside your organization." His jaw tightened slightly. "Costa identified it tonight while we were running the operation. One of Ferraro's junior associates. He's been passing information to the Calvano network for approximately 8 months. He paused. "Ferraro doesn't know. Or if he does, he's constructed an extremely convincing performance of not knowing." "What happens to him?" Nico looked at her steadily. "He's been removed from his position, and he'll be dealt with according to our code." "I need to know what that means," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She held the question in the space between them and didn't retract it, because she had decided several days ago that one of the non-negotiable conditions of being inside this world, even temporarily, even as a fiction, was that she was going to look at it directly rather than accept the version that was comfortable for everyone involved. "He'll be handed to the appropriate federal authorities," Nico said, anonymously, with enough documented evidence of his activities to ensure a substantial outcome. He paused. "That is how we handle internal matters when the alternative is a cycle of retaliation that serves no one." She hadn't expected that. She let it show slightly because he would read the concealment, and she preferred him to have the honest version. "That's not what I assumed," she said. "I know what you assumed," he said. There was no edge in it, just the acknowledgement of what she had reasonably believed about the kind of organization she was inside, and the quiet correction of the specific detail. "We are not without violence," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise, but we are not without limits either." She nodded. She filed it in the place she'd been filing things about him. The place that had been growing, she realized, not with the accumulating evidence of a threat assessment, but with something that functioned more like the accumulation of a person. The way you learned someone. The slow acquisition of the specific details that made them distinct from the general category you'd placed them in when you first understood what they were. She was very tired. She could feel it settling into her now that the operational adrenaline had finished metabolizing. The bone-deep tiredness of someone who had been running on cortisol and controlled breathing for hours, and was now on the other side of it with the full weight of the evening available to be felt. "Go to sleep," Nico said. He said it the way he said most things, without softness performing as kindness, but with the direct attention of someone who had registered her state and was responding to it. "In a minute," she said. She stayed for another hour. She didn't talk and he didn't push her to. He read. Actual reading, the focused kind, a document she didn't examine closely. She looked at the bookshelves. She thought about the list of things she needed to do in the coming days, which was a way of thinking about the future without looking at it directly. Contact the hospital, speak to her department chief, understand the extent to which her billing credentials had been used, and begin the process of separating her professional record from what Ethan had done with it. Call a lawyer, call her mother, which was a conversation she had been building toward with the specific dread of something that would require her to dismantle several comfortable fictions simultaneously. She thought about Madeline and felt the familiar compressed devastation of it. The friendship that had been real from her side and had been, from Madeline's, something she was still trying to understand. Not entirely false, she suspected, but built on a foundation of calculation that contaminated every memory she tried to examine. She would not call Madeline. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be a performance of either forgiveness or rage, and she had neither available. Eventually, she went to bed and slept for 6 hours without interruption, which was the most she'd slept in 3 weeks. The next days had the quality of aftermath. Not quiet exactly, but a different register of activity. The complex administrative work of the day after, rather than the operational intensity of the night before. Costa emerged from his session with Ethan with 30 pages of documented financial information, routing details, account numbers, the names of 3 Calvano intermediaries who had handled the actual movement of money through St. Cornelius's billing infrastructure. He presented it to Nico with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been awake for 22 hours and was running on the last reserves of professional function. Vivian read the 30 pages. She read them in the library, in the chair nearest the window, with the morning light coming in flat and pale through the glass. And she read them the way she read anything important, completely, without skimming, going back when something required re-examination. It took her 2 hours. When she finished, she set the pages on the side table and looked at the wall for a while. 4 years. The marriage had been, from Ethan's perspective, a financial instrument. She searched for the precise word and found it with the cold accuracy that was her particular gift. A vehicle. Not the target of a specific hatred, not even the target of a specific indifference. A vehicle. Something with useful properties that had been acquired for those properties and maintained for their continued usefulness. The proposal, the apartment she'd chosen, the anniversary dinners he'd occasionally remembered, all of it calibrated to the ongoing maintenance of a vehicle that needed to believe it was loved in order to continue functioning as intended. She understood this. She sat with it until it stopped being a wound and became a fact, which took longer than she expected and was not something she could have done 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, she had been a woman whose life had collapsed. She was something different now. Not hardened, she didn't think, or not only hardened, but reorganized around a more accurate picture of the available materials. She went to find Nico. He was in the operations room with Ruben, reviewing something on the central screen that he minimized when she came in, which she noted without comment. "I want to go to the hospital," she said. "Today. I need to meet with the compliance director in person, and I need to give a preliminary account of what I know before this surfaces in a way I can't control." Nico looked at her. "Calvano's people are still active in the city." "I know. Going to the hospital means exposure." "I know that too." She paused. "Ruben can come. 2 other men. I'll be in the building for 90 minutes and then I'll come back." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a physician with a professional obligation to an institution that was used without my knowledge for criminal activity. Dealing with that is not optional, and it's not something I can do by phone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Ruben. Ruben gave the slight nod of a man who had assessed the security geometry and found it manageable. 90 minutes, Nico said. St. Cornelius looked the same. That was the thing that struck her first. The lobby with its colored wall murals, the specific smell of the place that she'd long since stopped consciously registering, but that hit her now with the full force of something deeply familiar returning after absence. The woman at the reception desk looked up and said, "Dr. Hale?" with the mild surprise of someone who had been told she was on leave and had not expected her to appear, and Vivian said, "I have a meeting with Dr. Pressler," and walked through with Ruben 2 steps behind her, and everything feeling simultaneously completely normal and completely altered, the way places feel when you've been through something that hasn't reached them yet. Dr. Pressler was the compliance director, a careful, precise woman in her late 50s who had been in healthcare administration long enough that very little surprised her, and who listened to Vivian's account with the specific quality of attention that preceded a very large institutional response. Vivian told her everything that was relevant to the hospital's exposure. She told it clearly, chronologically, without performing distress, because the situation was serious enough without the performance, and because Pressler needed information, not emotion. When she finished, Pressler was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You had no knowledge of this." "None," Vivian said. "The routing used your credentials." "Yes, I've documented what I know about the mechanism. I have financial records." She slid the relevant pages, copies Costa had made, across the desk. "The federal investigation will reach the hospital eventually. I wanted you to have this before it did." Pressler looked at the documents. She looked at Vivian. "This is going to be a significant process," she said, "for you professionally." "I know." "Your position here is something I'd like to discuss when we have a clear picture of the full exposure," Vivian said. "What I can tell you today is that I intend to cooperate completely with any investigation and that I will provide everything I have." She paused. "I'd also like to return to work as soon as the legal situation allows, if that's possible." Pressler looked at her for a long moment, the assessing look of a woman who was trying to determine what she was actually dealing with, which Vivian understood was a reasonable project. "I'll need to involve our legal counsel," Pressler said. "Of course. And the board." "Of course." Pressler nodded, the nod of a woman who had absorbed something large and was already organizing the response. "I'll be in touch," she said. "Within 48 hours." Vivian stood. She shook Pressler's hand. She walked back through the hospital, past the pediatric ward corridor, past the wall mural of a blue whale that a 7-year-old patient had apparently inspired 3 years ago, past the nurse's station, where Raj looked up from a chart and gave her the specific look of someone who had approximately 40 questions, and the professional judgment to ask none of them right now. She walked through the lobby and out into the cold gray morning air. Reuben was at the door. He looked at her face and said nothing, which she appreciated. She called her mother from the vehicle. She'd been constructing the conversation for days and still didn't have a clean version of it. There was no clean version. There was only the true version, which was long and complicated and contained several things her mother was going to find very difficult to hear. She told her anyway. Her mother listened with the specific quality of silence that meant she was absorbing rather than formulating a response, which was one of the things Vivian had always valued most about her. When Vivian finished, her mother said, "Where are you?" Not "are you safe?" or "how could he?" or any of the things she might reasonably have led with. Just, "Where are you?" "I'm okay," Vivian said. "I'm somewhere safe." "With the man?" "Yes." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Is he good to you?" Vivian looked out the window at the city moving past. She thought about the vest, the hand at her back in the reception room, the question, "What do you want to do?" asked with genuine interest in the answer. The single sentence, "You don't have to be hard about this," said quietly enough that only she could hear it. She thought about a man who had made a calculated decision at her expense and had acknowledged it without defense when she'd called him on it. "Yes," she said, in his way. Her mother absorbed this. "Then tell me when you can come for dinner," she said. "And bring him if that's what's happening." Vivian almost smiled. "I'll tell you when I can come for dinner," she said. The Calvano situation resolved over the following 2 weeks in the way that Nico had predicted. Through negotiation rather than confrontation, which meant it was slow and unpleasant and required the specific patience of people who understood that the alternative was worse. The federal evidence Calvano had been holding became the central currency of the process. Costa had, in the course of his 30-page extraction from Ethan, assembled a counter-package of documentation connecting the Calvano network to financial crimes that significantly exceeded whatever they'd compiled on the Moretti operation. The mathematics were not subtle. Both sides had exposure. Neither side could afford the particular outcome of mutually assured federal investigation. The Port Morris territory was not surrendered. Boundaries were redrawn in less significant areas. The Calvano family's operations lieutenant, the man whose face Vivian had memorized in the light of the loading dock on the night she'd walked into all of this, was handed to federal authorities along with the documentation of the assassination attempt. The package was delivered anonymously. The indictment came within 3 weeks. Ethan Cross was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Vivian heard about it from Costa, who told her with the specific brevity of someone delivering a complete piece of information that required no elaboration. Federal charges, money laundering, conspiracy, wire fraud. The documentation was thorough. The case, Costa said, was the kind that prosecutors described as having good bones, which in legal terms meant Ethan was going to be in a room with a very clear accounting of his choices for a long time. Madeline was arrested the following Thursday on related charges. Vivian learned this from the news rather than from anyone inside the estate. She was in the library when it came through on the tablet Costa had eventually returned to her, and she read the brief item. Madeline Pierce, 38, financial consultant, arrested in connection with, and sat with it for a while in the way she'd been sitting with things. The grief of it was specific and strange. Not the grief of loss, exactly. She'd already lost Madeline, or rather she'd lost the version of Madeline that had existed in her understanding, which was perhaps the only version she'd ever had access to. It was the grief of the counterfactual, the friendship that had been genuine from her side, all those years of phone calls and birthdays and the pale sage dress at the ceremony and the actual tears, real tears, she would have sworn it, the grief of understanding that one person's sincerity is not a guarantee of the other person's. She closed the tablet and went to find Nico. He was on the terrace. It was the first time she'd seen him on the terrace. He used the grounds rarely, preferring the interior of the estate for reasons she'd attributed to operational caution and had never directly asked about. He was standing at the stone railing with a coffee cup in one hand and looking at the tree line in the early morning light that was doing something specific today, the low winter sun hitting the top third of the trees and leaving the rest in shadow. He heard her come out and didn't turn immediately, which meant he was giving her the option of the moment rather than converting it immediately into an exchange. She stood beside him. The cold was sharp and clean. Below the tree line, the estate grounds ran down to the inner fence in a long descent of frost-white grass that caught the light along the top of each blade and made the whole field look like something temporary. "It's done," she said. She meant the Calvano negotiation and the arrests and the specific chapter of consecutive disasters that had begun on a rain-soaked street 3 weeks ago when she'd walked away from a ruined anniversary dinner and into a service road where this man had been trying to survive. She meant all of it at once, and she thought he understood that. "Most of it," he said. "What's left?" He turned to look at her. He was unhurried about it. The full turn, the complete attention. "You," he said. "What you decide." She looked at him. The morning light was doing the same divided thing to his face that the lamp always had. One side clear, one side in shadow, the two halves of a person she had been learning in increments for 3 weeks and still had not finished learning. "I need to go back," she said. "To my life. To the hospital. To my work. I have patients. I have obligations that existed before this and that are still there." "I know," he said. "The fabricated marriage ends whenever you decide it ends," he said. "Ferraro will accept a quiet resolution. The circumstances justify it." He paused. "There will be no consequences for you from anyone in this organization." She nodded. She had known this, or believed it, but hearing it said directly removed a weight she'd been carrying in a low background way for days. "And you," she said, "what do you do now?" He looked back at the tree line. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant he was deciding how much of a true thing to give, which she had come to understand was not evasion, but the habit of a man who had spent a long time in an environment where the full truth was a resource to be managed. "There are things I've been considering for a long time," he said. "The direction of this organization, what it does and how, whether the shape it has is the shape it needs to keep." He paused. "Recent events have clarified certain things. The legitimate security and logistics enterprise," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, not quite, but the specific quality of a man who has found that someone has arrived at a conclusion he hadn't yet spoken. "How long have you been thinking about that?" he said. "Since I read the financial documents," she said. "The infrastructure you have, the transit access, the distribution networks, the established relationships with ports and carriers and customs brokers. The legal version of what you currently do illegally is a substantial enterprise. There's a market for it. International security, logistics consulting, supply chain protection." She paused. "You'd need a complete restructuring. You'd need lawyers and accountants and probably a federal compliance consultant for the transition period. You'd need to be willing to take a significant short-term revenue hit while the legitimate revenue scaled up. He was looking at her with the expression she had never fully decoded, the one that had been appearing since the first night in the operations room when she'd said something that exceeded his existing model of her. "You've thought about this seriously," he said. "I've had 3 weeks with limited activity and a library," she said. "Yes." He turned back to the railing. He drank his coffee. She watched the frost-white field catch the rising light along the blade tops and thought about the 50 different versions of the next year of her life that were currently available and the specific strange weight of having to choose between them when 3 weeks ago she'd believed she was inside a life with no such choices remaining. "Stay," he said. He said it the way he said the things that mattered, without theater, without the architecture of persuasion, just the word placed in the available space and left there. Not for the organization, not because of any of this. He turned to look at her. "Because I would like you to." She looked at him. She looked at the face she had learned in increments. The divided light, the old scarring on his hands, the gray at his temples that was premature, and the eyes that were gray too, and that looked at her with the complete attention of someone who had decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that she was worth the full investment of that attention. She thought about the vest and the hand at her back and the question asked with genuine interest in the answer. She thought about the thing he'd said in the cold outside the operations room. "You don't have to be hard about this." Not yet. The most unexpected mercy she'd been offered in the worst week of her life. She thought about the apartment with the amber-lit bedroom and the anniversary dinner gone cold, and the life she'd walked out of in the rain. The life she'd been building for 5 years on a foundation that had been false from the start. The loss of it had felt like destruction. Standing on this terrace in the early winter light, she understood it differently, not as destruction, as excavation. The false structure had to come down before the real ground was visible, and the real ground was what you built on if you were honest about what you were doing. "I need to go back to work," she said. "Full-time, my patients, my department, that's not negotiable." "I know," he said, "and I need to be myself in whatever this is. Not a role, not a cover. Myself." "Yes," he said. "And if you make a decision that involves my life," she said, "you tell me first." The corner of his mouth moved, the expression that wasn't quite a smile, but had always occupied the same territory. "Yes," he said. She looked at the field and the tree line and the first full light of the morning coming over the top of the trees and reaching slowly down toward the frost-white ground. She breathed in the cold air and felt it in her chest, clean and sharp and fully present, the sensation of being completely inside a moment rather than managing it from a careful distance. She thought about the woman who had stood in a loading dock doorway 3 weeks ago with her back against a metal door, frozen, watching something she had no framework for, making a choice to get into a vehicle because the alternative was a door she no longer had any reason to walk back through. That woman had been running on devastation and had not known it. She had believed herself to be destroyed, and she had walked forward anyway, which meant the destruction had not been the final word on what she was. "All right," she said. Nico didn't say anything. He set his coffee cup on the railing and looked at the field for a moment, and then looked at her with the full attention. The complete, undeflected attention that she had come to understand was not a technique but a character. The fundamental quality of a man who looked at the things in front of him without flinching and expected the same in return. She looked back. She had always been good at that. Below them, the frost-white field was warming by degrees as the morning light descended from the tree line toward the ground, the ice crystals along each blade of grass catching the light for a moment before they released it, and the field transformed in slow sections from silver to green, not all at once, not dramatically, but the way real things changed, incrementally, irreversibly, one small true thing at a time. She stayed, not because the life behind her had been worth nothing. It had been worth something, even built on false ground, and the grief of it would continue in the way that real grief did, without schedule or permission. Not because everything ahead was clear or safe or even fully visible from where she was standing, but because she had walked through a destruction that had turned out to be an excavation, and what it had uncovered was a version of herself she had not known she was capable of being until the night she'd had no choice but to find out. She turned from the railing and walked back inside. After a moment, she heard Nico follow. The door closed behind them. On the terrace, the coffee cup sat on the stone railing and the field below continued its slow warming, the frost releasing in the morning light without drama, without announcement, becoming simply what it had always been underneath, solid ground, waiting.